Hello and welcome to this week's episode of Mastering Dungeons. I'm Shawn Merwin here with the ready to rock and roll or rap or something, or wheeze, Teos Avadia. Hey, Teos.
Hello, Shawn. How'd your weekend go?
My weekend, I was traveling, so it was peaceful in the sense that didn't have my face in a screen.
Uh-huh.
And it was not peaceful in the sense that I didn't have my face in a screen. And now I'm going to have a lot of face screen time coming up. How about you?
Screen to the face.
Yeah.
I did a combination of yard work, which always pleases the family, and writing, which was good on something of my own. So that was great.
Mhm.
Also, one of my kids landed a scholarship, which is really vital towards the chaos that is still figuring out whether, if, what it takes
Mhm.
to pay for college.
Mhm.
There's a lot of government stuff that went sideways this year. So like we still really don't know this far into the year what tuition will cost, other than it'll
Yeah,
be horrible. But this good news made it some breathing room.
that's good.
Yeah.
I'm glad to hear that. If you are not a parent, or if you are a parent of a child who is not yet of high school slash college age, let me say this word, FAFSA.
Mm.
It's a word that you will come to hate if you do become a parent, or when your child gets to college age, if they choose to attend a uh, school of higher learning.
And I will say another word, which is 429, which is the
Uh-huh.
the
Yeah.
uh, ability to sock away money for your kids' tuition in favorable tax ways. And boy, is that important. If you have a kid, do that. Get the grandparents to do it, like,
Hmm.
because college is so unbelievably scarily expensive. Even in what would used to be the cheap places are no longer remotely
Mm.
cheap. They are what we might have paid for college at non-cheap places, and so it's just all sideways and horrible.
Yeah.
But hey,
Yeah. Yeah.
I don't know if this is true. This is a gaming podcast.
I've heard that. I've heard this is the 199th episode where
What?
you and I are co-hosting. Yeah.
Now,
So
truth be
luckily,
told, I once checked like the PDFs when we were setting up the website so you could search the episodes. We had
right.
sometimes double numbered and stuff, but I think it probably around evens out. So this is pretty
Yeah.
close to 199. But that means next episode, huge party.
Huge party,
I'm
huge
wearing
party.
no pants next episode.
As I pack for Gen Con, I will of course be fully focused on this particular podcast.
Yeah.
Uh, but thankfully, we have listeners who are focused on this particular podcast, and they often ask us questions or leave us comments, and we like to cover those in our listener corner. So thank you to everyone who listens and sends in your questions. We will tell you at the end of the episode where you can do just that. We're going to start with old friend of the show, and he's not old, but he is a long-time listener of the show, Andrew Bashinsky, via Twitter, who says, "Hey, Mastering Dungeons, I'm thinking about D&D at Gamehole Con in October." Me too, Andrew. Me too. This is my first edition
Yeah.
non-change.
Hmm.
What should I expect? Will games be slower with everyone learning? Will DMs who keep games in the 2014 rules disappoint players? Will encouraging 2024 rules or have 2024 pre-gens overwhelm them?
Mm.
The best answer is to all of those questions is absolutely, sometimes, probably, not necessarily, and no, in no particular order. Uh, so organized play campaigns are sort of a microcosm of the greater D&D community. So some organized play campaigns, some home games will probably continue playing like they have been with the 2014 rules and completely ignore the new rules, or at least make a choice not to go to those new rules for whatever amount of time they choose to do that, possibly forever. Some people are going to finish their current campaign with the 2014 rules, and then they will switch over to the new rules for the start of their next campaign. Some are going to turn, as soon as they have that nice, juicy player's handbook in front of them, They're going to say, okay, 2024 rules, remake your character. And that's the same for campaigns. Some will do one, some will do another. You just don't know. You need to talk to the individual campaign.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I remember from third edition to 3.5, a delightful table, and it was pretty far into 3.5, and a player at the table who was a well-known player in the region. He had this cleric that was super, super powerful in third edition because he would cast all these buffs that were all well-known. He'd spend basically the first 3 rounds in combat buffing up, and then would be better than everybody at the table combined. And he starts doing this, and the DM says, "Oh, just so you know, that's all been changed in 3.5." And he says, in a kind of a little bit of an angry angle to it, he says, "I didn't pay all this money for these books to go and then have them be updated." And there's this moment of quiet, and then the DM, and everybody's looking at the DM to see what'll happen, and the DM goes, "Yeah, okay." And so he just played his character as if it was a 3E game, and we were all playing 3.5. And I can think of countless examples like that, like a really well-known person, actually an admin for Adventurers League during the D&D playtests for 2014. So the D&D next period of time, there would be these updates, and so you had to kind of remember what had changed. And I think they'd also been playing Pathfinder, and so they ran a thing, and they made us confirm critical hits. And one of us at the table said, "I don't think that's in the playtest packet." And they're like, "Oh, I think it is." And we're like, "All right, whatever." And so we're rolling to confirm critical hits because just whatever. The game is still working. And it all worked. And that's my biggest point that I'd make is it's all going to work. Yeah. Enjoy it. Roll with it. There will be some shenanigans and hilarities. You will have people who probably will sit down and go like, "What? There's been an edition change?" And just, it doesn't matter. The game will be close enough that it will be, I think, more fun than problematic, especially if people just roll with it.
Right. And where it gets interesting, and I use interesting in every sense of that word, is when an official organized play campaign needs to toe the company line for a company. And that could be Adventurers League and Wizards of the Coast. If Wizards of the Coast is even still supporting Adventures League, because it seems to have been doled out to Bald Man Games and to Game Hole Publishing and to the Greasy Snitches and to other folks. So it's hard to even say, but I'm sure the same thing would happen with Pathfinder, right? Where the company says, "We are putting out the new books. You must play with the new rules." Right. And then the poor campaign administrators, and I remember being one of those, sort of has to say, "Okay, well, you're paying for this whole deal, so I guess what you says goes," except in the cases that Teos is talking about, where at an individual table, people were just like, okay.
I mean, we had that in 4th edition when I was an admin for Ashes of Athos, which is a world without clerics. So there were no divine power sources, classes with divine sources. And someone comes over at a convention to me and says, "What do we do? There are." I
think that was me.
Was it you?
I was
like a diva paladin and a whatever. But there were like young kids with a dad or something like that. And so we're all like, I forget if we told them at the end or then, but it was like, enjoy this game when you get a chance, swap out to non-divine casters because yada, yada, yada. But it's just, what are you going to do? You don't want to wreck someone's fun on an individual basis.
Right. So as we're saying, Andrew, will it be chaotic? Unless there is really clear communication and everyone gets that word, it's going to be a little bit chaotic. And that's just, if you've been in organized play long enough, you're used to the chaos on a regular basis. So this is just, 5% more chaos. The chaos goes up to 11.
And the hardest thing, I think, is the thing that maybe will give the most bumps at the table will often not be the characters, but the DM, who now has a style and a way of running things that's a decade or up to a decade old. And you're supposed to now use, the investigate action or whatever, these sort of stuff. And when the hardest part is actually players who really know the rules well, expect that and want that out of the DM. And the DM's not yet there to where they've really woven this into their way of running a game. And that's often the toughest part, the disconnect that feels rough to the gameplay. And that's just going to have to work its way
Yeah.
Little by
Yeah.
little.
I always, when I'm running games, try to use the correct terminology just to make everyone comfortable and just to keep everyone on the same page, or to teach if that is part of the
Yeah.
deal. And times like this, it becomes very hard to do that
Yeah.
when you're trying to do three things at once: tell a fun story, keep track of your players, keep track of the time, keep track of the encounter, and then also
Right.
say the right words at the right time to mean the right thing.
Yeah.
It becomes yeah.
And the real magic that I think is like the most magical, amazing thing is that like a year from now, we probably won't remember how 2014 worked if you've been
Mhm.
running a lot of 2024.
Yeah. Yeah.
And this happens with everything. I mean, I remember a year in, I played like into 5th edition, I played 4E. I was so rough at it. And this is something that I played, so many times a week. It was
Yeah.
unbelievable how much 4E I played, but the brain, especially mine, just jettisons old stuff and absorbs new. And
Oh,
so, you'll go through this rough period and then suddenly you'll be like, wait, how did the old stuff work? And you won't remember it.
I've got my finger on the delete button and I'm just waiting for the new books to drop, and then
Jettison,
boop,
jettison,
delete.
jettison. Yeah.
Everything will be gone, if hopefully, and the new stuff will go in there. And we have this other question from Paul via Blue Sky, who says, your discussion on mastering dungeons today prompted me to think about this. Curious what if you think this would work and be cool. And he's put up a chart, so I have to describe the chart for you. And Paul says, sometimes I wish D&D classes worked like this. And the chart has primary ability scores: strength, dex, con, intelligence, wisdom, charisma. Then it has a list of primary spell casters. So under strength is druid, under dexterity is bard, under constitution is sorcerer, intelligence is wizard, wisdom is cleric, and charisma is warlock.
Mm.
And then the same thing goes with the primary weapons users.
Mm-hmm.
So strength is fighter, dexterity is rogue, constitution is barbarian, intelligence is ranger, wisdom is monk, and charisma is paladin. And what Paul's asking is, would it be cool if, rather than their attacks using strength, a barbarian's attacks used constitution and a ranger's attacks used intelligence, and then the same thing for spellcasters? Bards would cast spells using dexterity as their primary attribute. And so if you can envision that, Paul's asking, what do you think? Would it work? Mm-hmm. So I have two answers. And Teos, at any point, if I start to ramble, please step in.
Yeah, sure.
Okay. So I like this, right? Most people's brains love uniformity. They love patterns. They love to put things into neat boxes that fit nicely and symmetrically. And we can have a fun and lively debate about whether a warlock or a sorcerer would be charisma or constitution or strength. So as a casual player, or even as a heavily invested player, this is fun to think about and discuss and debate. For me, it's along the same lines of questioning as, what does wisdom really represent, right? And we can get into a whole night's discussion about that and counter each other's points, et cetera, et cetera. Fun to discuss and think about. But in terms of game design itself, it doesn't really matter. What does matter is, in the game design, does all of it come together to work? So as a starting point, this would be an idea as a starting point where I would say, okay, I'm going to go down a path now and do this, and let's see how it works out. So the game design brain says, all right, so what caster type would strength most benefit to have? This chart has druid as the strength. And I understand game-wise or story-wise why you want that to be, right? They turn into other creatures, or they use strength more than, say, a wizard would. Absolutely. But the story needs to mesh with the game design, with the mechanics, with the numbers. So when I see strength as a spellcaster, my first thought is not story-wise which one fits. My thought is, do any of these wear armor, where heavy armor, where there might be a strength requirement. Because I would want to put the cleric, say, under strength, if that cleric is going to at some point have heavy armor proficiency. If heavy armor has a strength requirement, it doesn't do any good to put a class there, or it doesn't do as much good to put a class there that none of their subclasses or their class abilities give them that. So that's where you have to start thinking as a game designer.
Well, yeah, and I go a step further, which I know you have as well. I leapfrog that. I didn't even think of that nuance level. I just simply thought of like, well, armor class calculations or prerequisites for different things in the game, initiative issues, things like that. That like D&D dovetails really actually quite well together. All of these different relationships between the ability scores, the core game itself, and the classes. The benefit of that is that when we build a character, it's all very rich, right? Every character, regardless of what class they're making, generally and increasingly across the editions, the player has to worry about what their character has as the ability scores, regardless of what class they're playing. And that's kind of cool, right? The idea that, and this really started kind of around 3rd edition, where it was this idea of like, no matter what you're playing, you're going to sit there for a bit and go like, ooh, where do I put points in this? Or, where do I choose to put the 16 or the 12 or the whatever? Like, it all matters.
Right.
And that makes it fun because of skills, because of initiative, because of armor class, because of being able to climb up a wall, any of that. That makes D&D actually quite special. Games that do this of saying like, oh, let's use an ability score for every class or something like that, usually don't have that interaction. The way they handle it is by splitting it off and saying ability scores are 2 things, skills and your class stuff. And then how I calculate armor is not using your dexterity, because otherwise all the rogues are the best. And what I would do, and then they'll, and other decisions like that, right? They will calculate things like Constitution won't boost your hit points. Hit points are just based on class, right? So that you take out those equations and those ability scores dependencies, and now you don't have that intersection, which is maybe less interesting depending on the game.
Yeah, it's that then gets into all of what you said, and I'll go a step further to say,
Please.
My abilities, these ability score rankings don't irk me half as much as what ability scores mean for non-class things. If you are just a commoner and your strength doesn't add to something special, your intelligence doesn't add to something special, if you have no class abilities and no feats, nothing, you're just a commoner out there in the field fighting a dragon, what's important to you? Which ability score is most important to have? And that's where we get to the idea of a dump stat, a stat that, unless it's super important to you specifically for a class, it really doesn't mean anything. And I'd love to go through games, D&D, but other games that are more clones, and say, is strength really important? What does strength mean? And so what I've come up with, dexterity seems to me to be the most important stat in the game overall. Why? Because no matter what, it adds to your armor class, unless you have a certain feat or feature or wear armor that negates it. Initiative, super important in D&D, especially at high levels where going first can be the difference between winning and losing. Okay. What are most saving throws for spells or monster abilities? Dex, wisdom, and sometimes constitution. So right there, what you're saying is, if you use that chart, rogues, who are the fighter dex, and bards, who would be the spellcaster dex, are at an advantage over druids and fighters, where strength is important to them, but it's rarely used anywhere else except for encumbrance and wearing armor, which some games simply ignore, right? I would say more than 50% of games ignore encumbrance completely.
Right.
And so what I would love to see, if we're going to do this, is balance all of it. Balance every single thing. Don't have one stat be more important than the others.
Mhm.
And then you're off to a good start on designing a game that is more balanced overall.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, or you have to separate it out, right? I mean, those are the two options, or live with the lack of balance. I mean, that's what we did for many editions, right? All the early
Sure.
editions, I mean, dump stats were just so obvious. And different
Mhm.
editions tried to do different things. Like third edition made intelligence more important, which was perceived as being a great choice for your dump stat by making that decide how many skill points you received.
Right.
Fourth edition tried to do things like have all of these different saves, right? So that you would save against all these different things, and they were actually written on your sheet so you could see the importance of them. And then attacks had much more varied saving throws than you see even in 5e, so that these would come up more often, and you would need to worry about your charisma save, your your fort,
Right.
your whatever. Like these all came together to make that more less
Mhm.
skippable, less dumpable, right? Was the
Yeah.
point of it.
And something I came up with in like 30 seconds while I was thinking about let's go down this rabbit hole is, wouldn't it be awesome if every spell or ability that had a saving throw had two? Like you're trying to jump out of the way of a fireball. So you
Mhm.
can use either dexterity or intelligence.
Mm.
Dexterity to physically move, intelligence. And then what you could do is, for most saves, you take the higher. But
Mhm.
for certain monsters or certain spells or certain kinds of spellcasters who are super skilled, you have to take the lower of the
Oh
two
yeah.
for your
Uh-huh.
save. Uh, so there's a design space that you could use
Hmm.
by moving in this other direction. Now, would that work? It sounds fun right now. Go through and it's too complicated. Okay, I can see that. Right? You
Mhm.
have to keep track of two different things for every spell. You have to write it for every spell or ability. Yeah. So maybe it isn't a good idea. Maybe
Mhm.
there are problems with it. I wouldn't know until I went a little further.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
that's like where the brain of a game designer needs to go. And so that's why this simple, relatively simple question of a neat little chart, and it was really cool, and I love the idea,
Yeah.
uh, leads to so many different facets of game design.
Yeah. Totally. Absolutely. Good question. I like it.
Yep. All right, so let's then get into our news and commentary section, starting with just a little bit of news about, a new president of Wizards of the Coast.
Wow.
Uh, So last Thursday, Hasbro published an investor news release naming John Hight as president of Wizards of the Coast and Digital Gaming. They also named a new chief people officer for Hasbro as a whole. What do we know about John Hight, Teos?
Well, John has been the general manager for the Warcraft franchise at Blizzard Entertainment the past 2 years, overseeing all game development and operations for the Warcraft franchise's various products. And he served on the Blizzard executive leadership team. Sometimes you hear things that are on someone's resume, and then you look and you're like, I don't know, it feels a little thin. This doesn't feel thin.
Mhm.
Before that, he was an executive producer and vice president for World of Warcraft for 10 years. So 12 years overall at Blizzard, which is great. You know, that's one of the things we've talked about in the past. You like to see your executives stay at a place and have some allegiance to a
Mhm.
place, not just hop around, and to survive being there long enough, right? And be trusted with more over time. Um, Hasbro said, quote, John's addition makes a significant step in Hasbro's, or marks a significant step in Hasbro's strategic focus on digital experiences and video games. As president, John's role will include overseeing or oversight of Hasbro's network of gaming studios and digital licensing agreements. He will also lead strategy for Magic the Gathering and Dungeons and Dragons, while driving continued global growth for the division and uncovering new storytelling, tabletop, and digital experiences. On LinkedIn, John said, I've been a loyal player and fan of both Magic and D&D for as long as I can remember. I can't wait to meet all the talented team members at Wizards and continue their brilliant work fostering great friendships and connecting fans through these iconic games. Chris Cox, who is the Hasbro CEO and has in the past been the Wizards of the Coast president, said John's love of D&D and Magic the Gathering, combined with his leadership in video games, will be crucial as we expand our digital offerings to deliver what our fans crave.
Mhm. And yeah, all of that is at investor.hasbro.com. But if you just search new Wizards of the Coast CEO, you will get all of that information. And yeah, you have more to say, Teos.
Well, yeah, I mean, because it's interesting to see the reaction. Like Rascal News said something that was like on the order of, here goes Hasbro hiring somebody for, the wrong areas. And I heard some fan sentiments that were similar, that was sort of like, why are they hiring a video game guy? And so I just, I kind of separated my emotional part of my brain and tried to just kind of look at it. And I'm like, hey, what am I saying all the time? Like all the time I'm saying to folks, you know what? D&D needs to be bigger than tabletop. Tabletop has only so much growth. It can only cover so many salaries worth with its revenue.
Mm-hmm.
We've studied the numbers. You can read them on my blog of what I think D&D makes. So more money needs to come from somewhere to validate owning D&D. What has recently made money? Oh, Baldur's Gate 3, Monopoly Go, which made $2 billion in revenue, although maybe $100 million for Hasbro and Wizards. So, that's clearly been the exciting part of things. What kind of new initiatives do they have? Virtual tabletop, more D&D Beyond, Yeah, hiring a video game makes perfect sense. Like if you want to widen the brand, this is the best thing they've got going. I could argue that movies shouldn't be as dead as they seem to be in their portfolio, because we've talked about this in the show. They're no less risky than video games, and I don't think the revenue is really any worse. But fine, you got to pick one. This is a fine choice, and John looks like he really has the experience in this area. So I would actually really love to talk to John or to the vice president we talked about recently, because just to see kind of what their thoughts are in this space, and what kind of initiatives they'd like to pursue, because it is for a company as big as Hasbro is, and for a division as big as Wizards is, this kind of hire makes sense.
Yeah, you're always going to get the people looking, the clickbait. Oh, woe is the industry hiring a video game person. Like a video game person is some sort of evil mastermind.
Yeah, right.
They make video games, and obviously, as you said, Teos, I'm not going to repeat your brilliant statements, but you have to look toward the future. Yeah, I'm an old guy saying, yeah, you need to look to the future, right? I could be sitting here going, don't take away my gridded minis. But
except, look, DSR days, right? I mean, those gold box games are not only revered amongst people of our age, but also were a huge source of revenue for a while, right? And D&D was often at the forefront of video game anything, right? And in fact, all of video games trace their history back to D&D with levels and XP and gold and you name it, right? And so, I mean, loot boxes, boy, where did that come from? I mean, they're inexorably tied together, and so we shouldn't be shocked when a hire reflects that at all, neither revenue-wise nor thematically nor anything. The best case is actually something like this, right? Because what's great about video games is they can exist sort of separately, but tied to the D&D tabletop game. And your ideal world is one where the tabletop game part of the company is seen as vital, but isn't messed with, right? Isn't tinkered with and forced to change into some abomination. That's what you really don't want. And everything about this press release makes me feel good in that respect.
Yeah. This is important only because I said I was traveling, and so my wife and I were listening to a book called A History of Video Games in 64 Objects. And the Strong Museum of Play in Rochester, New York has this sort of video game and gaming hall of fame. And so they made this book to talk about the history of video games through these objects. And like the seventh or eighth object that they talk about was Dungeons and Dragons. And how important it was to video games. And I told my wife all the times I've heard people say, oh, D&D stole this idea from this video game. And I'm like, yes, they stole it from the video game. Yes,
Yep.
they stole hit points from video games. Sure, they did. So yeah, I'm interested and excited to see where the future leads because the next bit of news I think is equally important. If people were asking, well, why not a tabletop expert for president of Wizards? Because there is also this new position being advertised called product architect for Dungeons and Dragons, a new position listing for the D&D team. What do the requirements include? Conceptualize and drive all Dungeons and Dragons TRPG products in collaboration with game design and engineering teams with a particular focus on innovating our playable content for digital platforms, top of funnel new player experiences, and exciting co-created releases featuring external IP.
Wow, that's exciting. Jeez, what a
Yeah.
job. But there's more.
Yeah. Oh, there is so much more. Build product value across expressions and channels with an eye toward enhancing platform specific differentiated value for digital tools and virtual tabletops. Own and lead the product gating process for all major content releases. And it goes on and on and on. But what for me, this is the position for let's get a game designer who can translate rules on the tabletop to digital rules and all of the other things that Wizards of the Coast and Wizards of the Coast partners will make.
Yeah. I mean, this is a dream job for a lot of folks. So, in fact, I just routinely described it. And then, like 2 days later, my wife says, like, we're on a walk, and she's like, "So, do you want that job?" And I'm like, I like to dream about what I would do if I was there with this, but what a fun job, right? I mean, oh, and I hope this is actually a posting because a lot of times companies post something and they actually already have the person that's going to do this. They just are forced to make the posting. But I really do hope that they are looking at what kind of people, that they're bringing in candidates and looking at who could take this job, because it what a vital job and what an important job to have at the company in this time. And it's exactly what needs to be there. One of the worries I've had about D&D is the pillarization of it with D&D Beyond and the virtual tabletop and the actual typical tabletop we think of. And if those three things aren't connected properly, it can really spiral out of control. And these have been problems going back to TSR's history. So having somebody who can see across that and build that value properly, value for investors, value for Hasbro, for Wizards, for the fans, is super critical. And thinking through how all those different projects fit together is really important. We also, thanks due to Washington law, have the salary range of 122 to 204,000. Of course, this job is in super expensive Seattle, and one presumes that one has to be on site for this position. But that is, compared to most salaries in the TTRPG space, that is a great salary.
Yeah. And just to be clear, a lot of what we said at the top of this listing was sort of business jargon. As you go down the list, they talk about player options and new mechanics and world building and gameplay elements that align with, overall product goals. So it is not just digital and it's not just business speak. There is a call for, at least, and which is good that they're admitting there is a need for this sort of coordination between the books they publish digitally or otherwise, the games they put out digital or otherwise, the tools that they offer, tabletop being one of them, that all of this comes together and creates experiences that people can translate from one medium to the other.
Yeah. No, I love that. This job is exactly what I believe is needed at Wizards right now. And I love the posting. And I forget where I said this, but maybe it may have been on our Discord. Like, Wizards of the Coast job postings have actually been really, really good. Like, they have a very smart, holistic sense of what is needed. And it's been true of a lot of the positions, because this mentions things like reacting to market trends and player feedback, gameplay data to make decisions of where products should go. that's absolutely needed, right? I mean, these are the kinds of conversations we're having in the industry, in the hobby space that I see all the time recently, is around things like, what does the Vecna product do or not do? What does the marketing do or not do for us? What do the recent adventures feel like? Where do they fall short? What could be different? That kind, pulling that together to make smart decisions would make a really big difference, right?
And it's funny because last week or the week before we talked about Dan Rawson's
Mm-hmm.
expanded role going over to Hasbro Pulse. To me, this reads like what a president of D&D should be doing,
Yeah.
right? A vice president or director of D&D should be doing. So it just leads me more to wonder if Dan is moving
Oh, yeah.
sideways
Right.
into Hasbro Pulse territory. And this person, along with Jess, who was
Yeah.
named vice president for D&D, are sort of taking on the two branches of one person, most likely Jess, looking at sort of partnerships and licensing
Yeah.
and marketing and that side of things, branding. And this person, then the other branch, which is the rules and the implementation of those rules
Yes.
across media.
Yeah, absolutely. I hope great people come into these types of positions, and I'm excited to see what comes from it.
Mm-hmm. You want the 2024 Players Handbook, Teos?
I do right now. Thanks.
How about 6 weeks early?
That sounds lovely.
Okay, well, if you go to Gen Con and you are one of the first 3,000 people to get tickets and get in line, you will be able to buy yourself not just the 2024 Players Handbook, but a special version of the 2024 Players Handbook with a commemorative gold foil stamp.
Yeah, so that I looked at the D&D Beyond. The D&D Beyond website has a story on it. I didn't see the stamp part of it in this story, but I read about it on Ian World. Do you know exactly what this gold foil stamp is?
I read from the same source you did.
Okay.
I read that it would have this for just these initial copies.
Okay. Yeah, I'm curious kind of where this gold foil goes and so on, but that makes it even better if it's some special version of the player's handbook. Oh, man. And they're also going to have, this is on August 1st, is going to be the first official day of the US stamps being out. And so the Postal Service will have a reveal ceremony at Gen Con with Josh Herman, the head of art, Jeremy Crawford, and Chris Perkins, all there for autographs at 10 a.m. after the ceremony. And you can buy the stamps opposite from where you can get the player's handbook. And to avoid nuts lines, they're going to have a digital system so you can get tickets. It's all described on the Gen Con site and I think on the D&D Beyond site too. But you will actually get a ticket using the Gen Con event system, and that will give you your place so you don't have to beat each other with, sticks and lines and things like that.
Although if you do want to get into the line where there's beating with sticks, that's a different ticket.
Yeah, that's a great LARP.
It's more of a LARP thing, but next year, note to self. Speaking of things that seem like April Fool's jokes, Hasbro is making a Monopoly Go board game based on the Monopoly Go mobile game, which is based on the Monopoly board game published by Hasbro. So the mobile developer and licensee Scopely said that more than 8 million people play Monopoly Go every day of the week, and 10 million people play every day. I'm not sure what the difference is between that. But as you said earlier, Teos, it made like $2 billion in its first year. And maybe a quarter of that was spent on marketing and creation and so on. But it's big enough that Hasbro has decided, Hasbro has decided, you know what? There's enough people out there playing Monopoly Go that we should make a Monopoly Go board game. Never played Monopoly Go. We have discussed before the problematic nature of the actual Monopoly game, and as much as you might want to say, if you play by the rules, it's great. It's not. Whether you play by the rules or not. And so this will be an interesting experiment to see if a digital game that's very popular will translate into a board game that's very popular.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm curious whether the inventor of Monopoly, Elizabeth Maggie, what she would say of this turn of events, and how far it went away from the vision she had created, and how little she
Yeah.
got paid for it,
Mm-hmm.
given all of
Yeah.
this that has happened.
Yeah.
And of course,
That's
all the
a
game designers
cool.
everywhere are like, "Really, Monopoly? There's so many good games, Monopoly." But
Yeah.
that's the kind of stuff that I think needs to happen, right? Or not needs, but Hasbro wants
Mhm.
to see happen. Is, well, Monopoly Go, we were able to do this. How can we do this with other games, right?
Yeah. And
Other properties.
if you are a writer of fiction, you know that this happens in movies where a movie will be made based on a book and then there will be a novelization based on the movie, which is different than
Yes.
the book, which, for a traditionalist, for a uh, reactionary person, it rips your heart out. But you also realize that different people have different tastes, and it is not wrong
Nope.
to entertain people in a way that they wish to be entertained,
Yeah.
as long as no one's hurt in that entertainment. Go back to the beating each other with sticks in the line.
Yep.
Any other thoughts on that, or should we
No,
move
let's
on?
let's collect our 200 and keep going.
Okay, we do pass go. We collect $200, and we hear from Wulfgang Baur, CEO of Kobold Press, in an interview with EN World. In this interview, Wulfgang discusses Tales of the Valiant, kobolds as player characters, the Eonic lineage and heritages, and a lot more. What caught your eye about this interview?
He didn't, he could have just made this into a sales piece, and not that he doesn't answer questions, but he answers the questions that are asked. And then given the opportunity, he opens it up to mention other companies like Lazy Wolf Studios and Ghostfire that have worked on Tales of the Valiant tie-ins. But he also looks back on his experience at TSR and forward to the future, and chooses of his own volition to mention a number of other companies and games. Avatar Legends from Magpie, Cypher from Monty Cook Games, Modiphius, Delta Green, Starfinder, Night's Black Agents, RuneQuest. It's a really classy interview, and it's worth checking out, just sort of how he talks about the industry, and how he sees both what they are up to and doing at Cold Press of Tales of the Valiant and just the larger industry. It's not a long read, but I thought it was great. And it said,
Yeah.
I thought, it made a really favorable impression on me to go, wow, he didn't have to do this. And that's what he chose to do with his time. It was nice.
Yeah, Wolfgang has passed go and collected $200 a lot, and so
Yeah.
he's been around. He knows the industry. He is a wonderful human being on top of that, and so it was good to read that and to see his reflections on not just the current state of role-playing games, but sort of back with his experiences across the spectrum. Now to our creator corner, where first we start with Shadowdark solo rules for free. Tell us about this.
Yeah. I mean, everybody knows we hate Shadowdark. I'm kidding. I'm kidding. We love Shadowdark.
Love
Keep the
Shadowdark.
comments coming. Keep the comments coming.
Yep.
Kelsey Dione, who's awesome, one of our favorite game designers, she's created solo rules for Shadowdark and released them for the price of free. It's a 16-page supplement. I've downloaded it immediately when I heard about it. It has the same excellent style and format, evocative, kind of tight writing of Shadowdark itself. You will still create 2 to 4 characters, and then you'll use what she calls an oracle system to randomly determine answers to gameplay questions as you play along. Definitely worth checking out. Link in our show notes, or just go to thearcanelibrary.com, and from there you can find the solo rules for Shadowdark. It's free, so while you're there, pick something else up and make Kelsey happy.
Thousand Suns role-playing game has been translated into Spanish. Tell us about this, Senor
Yeah.
Abadia.
Friend of the show, Michael Pastor, hello, spotted that the Thousand Suns RPG has now a Spanish language translation. And so if you like an RPG based on the idea of imperial science fiction, and especially if you speak Spanish, then you'll want to check this out. So we've got links to our show notes. It is at the website outremer.es. So out and then remer.es. And then from there, you can get to the Thousand Suns Versión Física. And there's also a link in our show notes to the Grognardia website where the original, where the announcement came from about their RPG being turned into Spanish. So pretty cool.
And on Backerkit, we have a new launch called Nimble 5e. Teos, you took a look at this. What do you want to say about it?
Yeah, Evan Diaz has launched Nimble 5e. It's a 5e compatible RPG that aims for more creativity and teamwork, faster gameplay, easier to run games, and to make the game easier to learn for newer players. And on Backerkit, you can see a number of features that it shows off, including half-page character sheets instead of the busy 5e or Pathfinder character sheets. There's sort of nice comparison there. The product launched this week. It includes new classes and subclasses and a level 1 to 3 adventure. A preview was shared with us. I really like the layout and the format. Makes it very easy to pick up the game. It's nice. So even if you're just curious of like how to lay out an RPG well, this is worth looking at the preview. Actually, I forget whether the preview is available widely or not, but take a look at the screenshots and so on that are on Backerkit. So you can find Nimble 5e on Backerkit, and there's also a YouTube video. Links are all in our show notes that you can do to see kind of what this provides for you. So good luck to Evan on Nimble 5e.
Yeah. Yep. It launches in 22 hours from right now. So by the time this show drops, it will be launched and ready for you to review.